Book of the Week 51. This week was Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes. This book was pretty fascinating. Basically, Gary goes into depth on kind of uncovering some myths around dietary fat, what causes people to get obese, what causes heart disease, other chronic illnesses, and basically kind of undermines a lot of myths around that area and what causes that stuff. Looks into fat, cholesterol, also kind of looks into cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, some other metabolic syndrome, some other things as well. So there's a nice conclusion of his findings, and I'll just kind of read through these here and then kind of summarize what I thought about it all. But number one being a big one, which is dietary fat, whether saturated or not, is not a cause of obesity, heart disease, or any other chronic disease of civilization. Number two is the problem. The problem is the carbohydrates in the diet, their effect on insulin secretion, and thus the hormonal regulation of homeostasis, the entire harmonic ensemble of the human body. The more easily digestible and refined the carbohydrates, the greater effect on your health, weight, and well-being. So we've seen a lot behind that just in practice. Sugars and things that turn into sugar, carbohydrates really cause problems, much more than conventional wisdom tells us, and that fats, like I said in number one there, are not necessarily the cause. Granted, those coming from good dietary fat sources, things like grass-fed butter, coconut oil, MCT oil, that kind of thing, definitely, rather than trans fats or your hydrogenated oils, vegetable oils, and that kind of thing. So the type of fat does matter as well, but he doesn't get too in depth about the types of fat. Goes more in depth about civilization, how disease started, and so forth. Looking at studies behind that over time, over the past 100, 200, and even longer years. So, and he goes on to say, number three here, sugars, sucrose, and high fructose corn syrup specifically are particularly harmful because probably because the combination of fructose and glucose simultaneously elevates insulin levels while overloading the liver with carbohydrates. So this causes a cascade of effects, sucrose and then high fructose corn syrup, definitely some other sugars as well, glucose, things that turn into sugar, again, things like bread or potatoes or something like that where they don't necessarily have sugar right on the label, but yet are very, cause very similar spikes in blood sugar and insulin as well. Let's see, number four, through their direct effect on insulin and blood sugar, refined carbohydrates, starches, and sugars are the dietary cause of coronary heart disease and diabetes. They are most likely dietary causes of cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and other chronic diseases of civilization. So this is huge, where he's basically saying the sugar, the refined carbohydrates are pretty much the cause of a lot of chronic health issues, not necessarily the dietary fats. So he goes on in depth in the book. I mean, the book is really a tome. It's a pretty long book, and be my guest to read it if you're into this kind of stuff. It definitely takes a little while. He gets into the minutia of this stuff and the studies, why we were studying cholesterol, why cholesterol is not the only indicator. Total cholesterol goes into specific types of cholesterol, and then breaks those down into subcategories of cholesterol, which are actually even more important than just the HDL and LDL, for instance. So some pretty big statements, but he's very well researched. So definitely, I I would recommend reading the book. There's another book. It's called Why We Get Fat by Gary Taubes, and I think that's basically a book. It's a smaller book, and it's a lesser version of Good Calories, Bad Calories, or a shorter version, I should say. So then he goes on to say that number 5, obesity is a disorder of excess fat accumulation, not overeating, and not sedentary behavior. So we don't get fat by overeating or being sedentary. Common advice, consume less calories and then exercise more, and then you'll be fine. However, we don't, as a society, we don't look at how many calories are we consuming in the form of refined carbohydrates versus, like something like a grass-fed butter or salmon. 100 calories of Pop-Tarts is not equal to 100 calories of salmon. So they have hugely different effects on hormone levels, leptin, ghrelin, CCK, and a variety of different hormones that really control weight a lot more than just calories by themselves. So he really makes that differentiation between a calorie is not a calorie. They don't do the same things. A calorie of fat doesn't do the same as a calorie of carbohydrate, for instance, or protein for that matter. And then also the type, that greatly matters too. So just debunking some common assumptions about weight loss, what causes us to get fat, and so forth, what causes disease. So he goes on to say, number 6, consuming excess calories does not cause us to grow fatter any more than it causes a child to grow taller. Expending more energy than we consume does not lead to long-term weight loss. It leads to hunger. So he goes on in the book he goes into greater detail in studies around caloric deprivation and the likelihood of people staying on those diets, their effectiveness, and so forth. And they found that caloric deprivation is not effective, and actually lots of times will bounce back into people consuming more of the wrong types of foods, again, not necessarily just calories, and then putting on more weight. So they're not really addressing the hormonal regulation that goes into maintaining a lean body mass. So goes into really a lot of great studies behind that, which are definitely really important. And then talks again about more of a mild ketogenic type diet where we're consuming a lot lower carbohydrates. The carbohydrates that we do consume would be very nutrient dense. Things like green leafy vegetables, lots of those different things, broccoli, cauliflower, asparagus, kale, chard, those kinds of things where they don't have much sugars or simple carbohydrates that would raise our blood sugar or our insulin, which would then have a negative impact. Raising those would have a negative impact on our body composition, basically. So, consuming a lot of sugar, as I've read, not only in this book, but in multiple other books in all of functional medicine, sugar not only leads to chronic inflammation, but, a host of other chronic issues. So number 7, fattening and obesity are caused by an imbalance, a disequilibrium, in the hormonal regulation of adipose tissue and fat metabolism. Fat synthesis and storage exceed the mobilization of fat from the adipose tissue and its subsequent oxidation. We become leaner when the hormonal regulation of fat tissue reverses this balance. So basically, getting into a lower carbohydrate diet, our body starts to utilize fats as fuels rather than sugars and carbohydrates. And so when this happens, when we lower our carbohydrates so much, our body has a really easy time transitioning from using our own fat storages as fuel, and then also dietary fat sources. So that's kind of what happens when we lower our carbohydrate load and then force our body to burn another fuel source. Think of it like a hybrid vehicle almost. So burning gasoline and then also electric. So you have the ability to burn both. And so when we're talking about ketosis, it's not like we're going into full-blown ketosis, although that he does talk about that in the book as well. And but kind of balancing between the two, having adequate carbohydrates, not too low, but definitely not too many. And I think as a society, we consume way too many carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates at that than we need to for health, for optimal health. Let's see, insulin. Number 8, insulin is the primary regulator of fat storage. When insulin levels are elevated, either chronically or after a meal, we accumulate fat in our fat tissue. When insulin levels fall, we release fat from our fat tissue and use it for fuel. So basically what I was just saying, when we consume a high sugar, high carbohydrate meal, inevitably our blood sugar and our insulin levels will be elevated, thus decreasing the likelihood of us burning fat as fuel. So like he says here, accumulating fat in our fat tissue. When we lower our carbohydrates, so like he's saying, when our insulin levels fall, which would be preceded by low carbohydrate intake, then we do start utilizing fats as fuel. Just like he says here, we release fat from our fat tissue and use it for fuel. So again, more along the lines of a mild ketosis there, that just meaning burning fats for fuels. Number 9, by stimulating insulin secretion, carbohydrates make us fat and ultimately cause obesity. The fewer carbohydrates we consume, the leaner we will be. So again, this goes back up to what we were saying before, how decreasing the amount of calories doesn't necessarily mean weight loss or health for that matter. But decreasing the amount of carbohydrates while simultaneously consuming healthy amounts of protein, good quality, good amount of fats as well, then that will basically, you'll have a lean body composition, you'll be much healthier, you'll be definitely less likely to be having things like metabolic syndrome, chronic illnesses, cancer, Alzheimer's, dementia, diabetes, all that kind of thing. So they all really lump together those chronic illnesses when people's blood sugar is out of whack, especially high. People are consuming excess carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, high fructose corn syrup. Those chronic illnesses seem to crop up kind of all at once, or one on top of the other. So let's see here. And then the last one here, by driving fat accumulation, carbohydrates also increase hunger and decrease the amount of energy we expend in metabolism and physical activity. So this is huge. Example of this would be when we consume a higher carbohydrate meal. Let's say we just have a banana. Our blood sugar would go way up and then way down, and then our hunger would be increased. So again, this is all predicated on the hormone release rather than strictly looking at calories and how many calories we consume. So it's much more impactful to look at the type of calories you're consuming, like fats and proteins, more so than the carbohydrates. So when we consume those and we get the proteins and the fats, we get into a state of ketosis, which would drive down hunger and would drive up satiation. And also consuming fats and proteins in general help with that, and also help to stabilize blood sugar too. So they really help with a lot of different things. So again, that's all. Those were his main points, but um, very, very good book. Well written, well researched, and it definitely challenges some commonly held assumptions. So I would encourage you to check it out. But if not, I hope this was very helpful. Post any questions that you have, and I'll be happy to answer them. But Good Calories, Bad Calories. Great book.